September 1944. A German officer stood frozen on a Texas dairy floor, watching gallons of fresh milk pool around her boots. She had just made a terrible mistake. Back in Germany, people were mixing water with powder just to feed their children. Here, her American enemy had trusted her with thousands of gallons of pure abundance. She waited for punishment, for the yelling, for the cruelty she'd been promised would come. Instead, the American foreman walked over, looked at the spill, and said 4 words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "We spill milk, not blood." This is the story of how 8 German prisoners of war discovered America's true secret weapon. And it wasn't what anyone expected. The sun rose sharp and white over central Texas that September morning, pouring across a landscape so flat it seemed the earth itself had surrendered to the sky. A military truck rattled down a dirt road, its metal sides clanging with every rut and stone. The sound carried across empty fields where cattle grazed beneath windmills that turned lazily in the hot air. Inside the truck sat 8 women in faded gray uniforms, their faces blank with exhaustion and fear. None of them spoke. Their eyes were fixed on the parched landscape outside, so different from anything they had known. For 3 months they had been moving. France to England, England to New York, New York through the vast American heartland by train. And now this final leg deep into Texas toward a destination no one had bothered to explain. The oldest among them was Margaret Schmidt. Her friends in another life had called her Magda. She was 35 years old. Before the war, she had managed supply chains for a textile factory in Hamburg. Clean offices, neat columns of numbers, the satisfaction of systems working exactly as they should. Then came 1940 and the Wehrmacht had found her, not to fight, but to organize, to manage, to turn chaos into order across an entire continent. By 1944, she was coordinating supplies for a full regiment stationed in Brittany. Fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies. Thousands of tons moving through her logistics networks every week. She had never fired a weapon, but her efficiency had kept German soldiers fed, armed, and moving. Some might say that made her more dangerous than any infantry soldier. After D-Day, when Allied forces swept through France like a summer storm, Magda had refused evacuation orders. There were documents to destroy, codes to burn, the kind of sensitive material that could compromise operations across the entire Western Front. She had stayed at her post, methodical to the end, until American soldiers found her in an abandoned headquarters building, calmly feeding papers into a failing furnace. The officer who took her surrender had seemed almost disappointed that she wasn't armed. He had given her water instead of handcuffs, processed her as a prisoner of war with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency she recognized and respected. That had been 3 months ago. Now she sat in the back of a truck with 7 other women heading toward what the American sergeant had called a labor reassignment. The words meant nothing to her. In her mind, it meant punishment. Every rumor they had heard about American camps was worse than the last. Forced labor in mines, starvation rations, public humiliation. The Nazi propaganda machine had spent years building an image of American brutality, and even now, even as prisoners who knew better than to trust propaganda, some part of that poison lingered. The silence inside the truck grew heavier as the road narrowed and the sound of machinery filled the air. In the distance, Magda saw tall, silver tanks glinting in the sun. A white farmhouse. Men in wide-brimmed hats walking among cattle. Not a military installation. Not a factory. A farm. The driver stopped without warning and banged on the side panel. Out. The word was simple, final. The women hesitated, but the heat pushed them forward. Dust swirled around their boots as they stepped onto dry ground. No fences, no guns pointed at them. Only open fields and the smell of hay and something else. Something clean and mechanical that didn't belong on a farm. A woman appeared from the barn wiping her hands on a towel. She wasn't a soldier. She wore a light blue dress and practical shoes, her hair pulled back in a simple bun. She looked to be in her mid-40s, with the kind of face that had known both hard work and deep loss. She smiled. Not the cruel smile of someone with power over the powerless, but something warm and deliberate. "Welcome, ladies. You'll help us with the milking." The words didn't make sense. Prisoners were never welcomed. Magda, standing at the front of the group, waited for the trick, for the command to kneel or dig or scrub. but nothing came. The woman simply gestured toward the barn. "It's cooler inside." Magda looked at the others. They were as frozen as she was. Was this kindness real? Could mercy exist in the land of their enemies? Her throat tightened with a confusion more painful than fear. Everything she had been taught about the Americans, that they were brutal, mechanical, without soul, was being rewritten in the heat of that Texas morning. If compassion could appear here among enemies, what else had they been wrong about? The air inside the barn hit them like a physical force. Cold, startlingly clean, alive with a low mechanical hum that vibrated through the floor. It smelled of metal and soap, not animals. The women stopped in the doorway, blinking at the brightness. The walls were whitewashed. The floor was smooth concrete that gleamed under electric lights so bright they seemed to generate their own heat. And from the ceiling hung a web of stainless steel pipes glinting like some kind of industrial nervous system. They had imagined straw and buckets and aching hands. Instead, they found a machine that breathed. Rows of cows stood calmly in metal stalls, each one connected to humming, milking units that pulsed with steady rhythm. The sound was hypnotic. Soft suction, faint hissing, an occasional click of a valve adjusting pressure. Magda stepped forward as if entering a chapel, unable to reconcile what she was seeing with what she had expected. The woman in the blue dress, Mrs. Henderson, they would learn, picked up one of the hoses and demonstrated with practiced ease. She attached it to a cow's udder, and milk began to flow through a clear tube into a shining tank nearby. "This does the work for us. It's cooled right away so it doesn't spoil. You'll help keep the lines clean." Her voice carried pride, but not arrogance, just the calm of someone who understood her world completely. Magda translated for the others in a whisper, but her own voice shook. She could not decide what amazed her more, the technology or the trust. A young Texan man in dusty boots stood beside a control panel filled with gauges and switches. He looked over and smiled briefly before flipping a lever. Instantly, a dozen hoses detached and began rinsing themselves with jets of steaming water. The process was automatic, methodical, efficient. Anna, the youngest of their group at 19, gasped softly. "It cleans itself." The words were barely audible, spoken in disbelief. Magda nodded slowly. She had overseen supply chains in France where efficiency meant shouting and punishment, where every mistake brought consequences designed to ensure it never happened again. Here, machines obeyed quietly, perfectly, without fear. The guard who had escorted them from the camp leaned against a post and spoke in careful German. "This milk goes to schools, hospitals, the army. Texas feeds half the South." His tone wasn't boasting, just stating fact. But the words stung like accusation. Back home, families waited hours for bread. Mothers stretched powdered milk with water to make it last longer. Children cried from hunger. Here the enemy's barns overflowed with abundance, so casual it seemed almost sacred. Mrs. Henderson handed Magda a clean rag and a metal brush. "You'll start with the outer valves. Wipe them after every cycle." Magda took the tools automatically, unsure whether to thank her or bow. No one shouted. No one watched her every move with suspicion. The rhythm of the machines guided her, and soon she was moving with them. Wipe, rinse, dry, like part of the system, like she belonged. When the first shift ended, the women were led outside to rest. The noise of the dairy faded behind them, replaced by the gentle wind over the grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Magda sank to the ground, staring at her hands still warm from the machines. "They call this a farm," she whispered to no one in particular, "but it's a city of milk." The others sat in silence, overwhelmed. One of them tried to laugh, but it ended up crying instead. Liesel, the young nurse who had tended wounded soldiers in field hospitals across France, buried her face in her hands. That night in the barracks, Magda wrote in the journal she had kept since her capture. Her handwriting was small and precise, the habits of an officer who had learned to conserve paper. "We thought America was all smoke and movies. Today I saw a machine milk a cow. No soldiers, no whips, no fear, just quiet order. If this is how they fight wars, we never stood a chance." She paused, her pen hovering over the page. Then she added one more line. "I do not know what to believe anymore." If you or someone in your family served during World War II, whether stateside or overseas, this story will feel familiar in ways you might not expect. If you remember the values that made the greatest generation truly great, you'll recognize them in what happens next. Hit that like button if you believe kindness can be more powerful than cruelty. And stay with us because what these German women discovered in that Texas dairy changed the course of the Cold War in ways most history books never mention. September 1944. While Allied forces pushed toward Germany's borders, America faced an unexpected challenge on the home front. Over 400,000 German prisoners of war scattered across camps in 46 states. These weren't concentration camps. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs had to be treated humanely. But in Texas, something unusual was happening. Labor shortages from the war effort meant American farms and factories desperately needed workers. And so German soldiers who had fought against American troops found themselves doing something no one could have predicted: milking cows in Central Texas. Margaret Schmidt hadn't planned to become a soldier. Born in Hamburg in 1909, she had studied logistics and industrial engineering at a time when few women entered such fields. Before the war, she ran supply chains for a textile factory. Clean work, intellectual work, the kind of career that required precision and planning. When Germany invaded France in 1940, the Wehrmacht recruited her for exactly those skills. Not to fight, but to manage. By 1944, she coordinated supplies for an entire regiment. She never fired a weapon, but her efficiency kept German soldiers moving. That made her valuable. And when the Allies came, it made her a target worth capturing. Now, 3 months after her surrender, she found herself in a place so far removed from everything she had known that it might as well have been another planet. And the strangest part wasn't the technology or the abundance. It was the absence of cruelty. At dawn the next morning, the sky was washed in pale gold, and the dairy was already alive. The machines had not stopped through the night. The hum was constant, like the pulse of something enormous living beneath the earth. Magda followed Mrs. Henderson through the long corridor where pipes ran along the ceiling like silver arteries. The air was cool, carrying the faint sweetness of milk mixed with the sterile scent of disinfectant. The floor gleamed polished not for show, but for precision. Everything here served a purpose. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was decorative. It was beautiful in its efficiency. They entered the processing room where 2 American workers were adjusting a series of valves. One of them greeted Magda with a polite nod before pulling a lever. From somewhere above, the sound of rushing liquid filled the air. Milk poured through glass tubes into a massive steel vat that hissed softly as cold water circulated through its outer shell. A gauge flickered between numbers. Magda couldn't look away. The machinery didn't just work. It breathed, synchronized like an orchestra where every instrument knew exactly when to play. Each tank holds over 3,000 gallons. Cooled in 15 minutes, bottled within the hour. The man spoke with quiet pride, not arrogance. For him, this was normal life. For Magda, it was revelation. In Germany, even factories dedicated to the war effort struggled for fuel and electricity. Here in the middle of a cattle field, technology ran so effortlessly it felt unreal. Liesel and 2 other women were assigned to the bottling area. They stood behind a long line of glass bottles, moving steadily along a conveyor belt. Machines filled capped, labeled, and packed them into crates with mechanical precision. Magda watched transfixed as crate after crate slid forward. Each label bore the same words: produced in Texas, fresh daily. She counted quietly. 20 bottles every 10 seconds. 1,200 bottles an hour. She did the math automatically, the habits of an officer still intact. Her stomach turned at the scale. One farm producing more milk in a day than entire German provinces could deliver in a week. When the whistle blew for a short break, the women stepped outside into the bright morning sun. Across the yard, trucks waited, with engines running, their beds filled with crates. One driver leaned against the hood, smoking lazily. Army takes half. Schools get the rest. Kids drink it free. The word free caught in Magda's mind like a stone in a river. In Germany, everything cost something: rations, loyalty, obedience. Here, milk flowed without measure, and even children of the poorest families drank it daily without question. Back inside, she stood beside a cooling unit where steam drifted from the pipes. Mrs. Henderson joined her, drying her hands with a towel. "You ladies learn fast. The machines don't scare you anymore." Magda tried to smile. "They are beautiful." The word came out before she could stop it. Mrs. Henderson laughed, surprised and pleased. "Never heard anyone call them that before." "But yes, they are. That afternoon, a minor malfunction stopped one of the lines. Magda instinctively stepped forward, watching how the Americans worked. Not shouting, not blaming, just fixing. One man loosened a valve, another replaced a gasket. Within minutes, the line was running again. No panic, no punishment, cooperation instead of fear. It struck her harder than the technology itself. This was how they fought. Not with bullets, but with order. Not with propaganda, but with abundance. America's power wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, relentless, and utterly certain. At noon, a woman arrived with lunch baskets covered in clean white cloths. She carried herself with the calm authority of someone used to caring for others. The German women had learned her name was Rose Brennan, the foreman's wife. Eat girls. She set out tin plates and mugs of cold milk. The food was simple: cornbread, beans, sometimes meat stew, always warm, always more than enough. At first, the German women ate quickly, heads lowered, half expecting the meal to be taken away. But Rose sat down beside them and began to talk as if they were neighbors, not enemies. "My husband's over in France right now, fighting near where you probably were." She said it without bitterness, just fact. Magda translated for the others, her throat tight. None of them knew what to say. How do you respond when your enemy's wife feeds you and tells you her husband is in danger because of your country without a trace of hatred in her voice? One of her sons works this farm. Another joined the Navy. He's probably somewhere near your country right now. Rose paused, looking at each of them in turn. Funny how that works, isn't it? The afternoon shift began, and Magda found herself working alongside Frida, the engineer who had managed factory systems in Berlin before the war. They moved in quiet coordination, two women who understood machines speaking the universal language of maintenance and care. Then it happened. Magda was cleaning a heavy tank lid, 30 pounds of stainless steel. Her hands, still soft from years of office work, couldn't get proper grip on the wet surface. The lid slipped, crashed into the valve below, and milk erupted, gallons of it, flooding across the spotless floor, white and pure and utterly wasted. Magda froze. Her face went pale. The other prisoners stopped work, terror flooding their faces. They knew what came next. Punishment. Always punishment. In Wehrmacht, logistics waste meant consequences. An officer who spilled fuel faced court-martial. A worker who broke equipment was beaten, sometimes worse. Efficiency was maintained through fear, and fear required examples. She braced for what she had been trained to expect: the shouting, the violence, the public humiliation designed to ensure she never made such a mistake again. Tom Brennan, the foreman, walked over. He was a tall man in his early 50s with the weathered face of someone who had spent his life working outdoors. He looked at the spill, looked at Magda's face, pale, embraced for violence, and he chuckled. The sound was so unexpected that Magda flinched. "Don't worry, miss. We spill milk, not blood." He handed her a rag and walked back to work as if nothing had happened. 4 words. "We spill milk, not blood." Magda knelt on that floor, wiping up the mess, but her vision blurred. Not from tears, from the collapse of everything she had been taught. In Germany, mistakes demanded punishment. Weakness invited cruelty. Mercy was for the naive, and kindness was a luxury no serious nation could afford. Here, an American foreman whose brother was fighting Germans at that very moment had shown her compassion for a simple mistake, had treated her like a human being who made an error, not an enemy who deserved suffering. That night, lying in her bunk, Magda wrote in her journal by the dim light of a single bulb, "Today I dropped expensive milk. The Americans said we spill milk, not blood." 3 words that undid years of training and pride. In Germany, mistakes demanded punishment. Here they demanded understanding. I used to think discipline meant obedience. Here it means cooperation. Machines do not serve cruelty, they serve trust. I do not know what to believe anymore. She closed the journal and lay in the dark, listening to the quiet breathing of the other women. Outside, the generators hummed. The dairy never stopped. Even in sleep, America worked. Abundant, relentless, kind. And somewhere in her chest, something she had thought was permanently hardened began very slowly to crack. By the 3rd week, the women no longer flinched at the sound of the siren that marked the start of the shift. They rose before sunrise, washed in cold water, tied their hair back, and walked in silence toward the barn that had once terrified them. Now the hum of the machines felt almost familiar, like a song they had learned by heart. The Americans greeted them each morning with a casual word that still felt strange in their ears, but had begun to sound less like a command and more like a welcome. Howdy, simple, friendly, impossibly American. Magda found herself giving orders in English, now her accent softening as she spoke. The irony wasn't lost on her. A German officer commanding in the language of her captors. Yet no one corrected her. They listened, trusted, followed. At noon, the heat outside grew heavy, and Rose Brennan arrived with lunch baskets as she did every day. She carried herself with that same calm authority, setting out plates and cups as if feeding enemy soldiers was the most natural thing in the world. Eat, girls. The food was always simple. Cornbread and beans, sometimes meat stew, always warm, always enough. At first, the German women had eaten quickly, heads lowered, half expecting the meal to be taken away. But Rose sat down beside them every time and talked. About the weather, about the cattle, about her life at Farmo. My husband Tom is the foreman here. He's having a hard time with all this. You being here. She paused, not looking for sympathy, just stating truth. His brother Jim lost a brother at Normandy. June, 3 months ago. Daniel was 22, another pause. No bitterness in her voice. Just the weight of grief carried with dignity. My husband's over in France right now, fighting near where you probably were. Maybe he'll meet some of your people. She smiled, gentle and sad. Funny how that works, isn't it? Magda translated for the others, her throat tight. None of them knew what to say. How do you respond when your enemy's wife serves you lunch and tells you her family members are dying because of your country, without hatred, without blame, with nothing but exhausted acceptance of the way things were? That afternoon, while cleaning a line of cooling tanks, Magda lost her grip on a heavy lid for the second time that week. Several gallons of milk spilled across the floor, gleaming white under the factory lights. She froze again, the old fear rising. But Tom Brennan simply walked over, glanced at the mess, and smiled. Don't worry, we spill milk, not blood. The same words as before, as if her mistakes were expected. Normal. Human. He handed her a rag and went back to work as if nothing had happened. Magda knelt to wipe the floor, but her vision blurred. The sentence echoed inside her chest until it hurt. 3 words that had become her anchor in this strange new world. We spill milk, not blood. In Germany, mistakes demanded punishment. Here they demanded understanding. The difference was so profound it felt like discovering gravity worked backwards. That night she wrote it in her notebook. We spill milk, not blood. Then she stared at the words for a long time, trying to understand what they meant about the country she had served and the country that had captured her. The days that followed were filled with small acts of humanity that confused and comforted her in equal measure. When a sudden rainstorm flooded the yard and one of the Texan workers passed out raincoats to the women before taking one for himself. Another worker showed Liesel how to tune the radio to catch music instead of static. Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade floated through the barn, mixing with the sound of clinking glass and humming machines. The melody made them ache for a world that might have existed if war had never come. Liesel hummed along softly, and no one told her to stop. On Sundays, when the dairy shut down for maintenance, Rose invited the women to her porch. She served lemonade and showed them family photographs. Children in school uniforms. Soldiers in crisp hats. A wedding picture taken under a pecan tree. The women stared at the images of peace as if looking into another universe. Magda picked up one photograph, her fingers careful on the edges. We have trees like that by the Rhine. Rose looked at her for a long moment. Maybe one day you'll see them again. The words hung in the air between them. Maybe. One day. A future neither of them could quite imagine, but desperately wanted to believe in. One evening as the sun dipped low, the Texan workers stayed late to clean the bottling line. A teenage girl, the foreman's daughter, brought a small phonograph and played a record. Music filled the room again, soft and steady. Without thinking, the German women began to hum along. No one stopped them. For a few minutes, enemies shared a song. Later that night, Magda lay awake listening to the crickets outside the window. She realized she no longer felt like a prisoner. Work had become routine, faces had become familiar, and kindness had become unbearable in its simplicity. They have conquered us without cruelty, she thought. That is the power we never understood. By October, the rhythm of the dairy had become their second language. The German women no longer needed translators or constant instruction. They moved through the plant with quiet confidence, anticipating what came next. The hiss of the steam valves, the chill of the cooling tanks, the subtle tremor in a pipe that signaled a pressure drop. What had once felt alien now felt natural. Even the Americans had begun to trust them completely. The guards, once ever present, stayed outside the gates, now reading newspapers or drinking coffee, while the women worked unsupervised inside. They were simply part of the operation. Magda had been assigned to quality control, a task that suited her former life as a logistics officer. She checked temperatures, logged output, verified cleanliness. Each figure written in her notebook felt like a quiet act of redemption. One morning, she calculated that the plant had produced nearly 12,000 bottles in a single shift, more milk in 10 hours than her entire district in Germany could have supplied in a month. She didn't share the number aloud. She barely believed it herself. The transformation went beyond the machines. Work no longer felt like submission. It felt like purpose. The women took pride in doing things correctly and meeting the same standards as the Americans. Liesel learned to fix a jammed conveyor belt faster than anyone in her section. Frieda, who had been an engineer in Berlin, took over sanitizing the equipment, humming as she worked. Even the quietest among them had found their place. The Americans noticed. "These girls have grit," Tom said one afternoon, watching them through the window. During lunch, the workers talked freely now. The conversations were simple: weather, crops, news on the radio, but for the first time they shared them as equals. When an American asked Magda if she missed home, she hesitated before answering. "I miss what I thought it was." He nodded, not pressing further, understanding without needing explanation. That evening, as the last batch of milk was sealed and labeled, Magda stood by the bottling line, watching crate after crate slide away. She tried to imagine how this looked from above. Lines of farms feeding into trucks, trucks into trains, trains into cities. A network so vast that no single failure could stop it. This was not chaos. It was organized life. She thought of Germany's factories, still efficient, but suffocating under fear, where workers obeyed orders instead of understanding them. Here, discipline came from pride, not terror. That difference, she realized, was everything. Later that week, Mrs. Henderson approached Magda with a clipboard. "You've been here long enough to know how this place runs. Would you help me train the new girls coming in from the next camp?" For a moment, Magda could not speak. She had been a prisoner for months, yet now she was being trusted to teach others. Something in her chest cracked open. Something she hadn't felt since before the war. "Yes, I can help." That night, she stayed up late by the dim light of a lantern, writing in her journal. "Today I was asked to teach, not ordered, acid. In Germany, we feared failure. In Texas, they expect success. Machines here do not demand cruelty. They require care. People too." The words steadied her hand as she wrote them. This was truth, simple and profound. The kind of truth that changed everything. By mid-November, the women worked entirely without guards. The Americans came and went freely, leaving them keys, tools, even responsibility for the storage room. Magda sometimes caught herself giving orders in English, her accent softening with each passing day. Yet no one corrected her. They listened, trusted, followed. One evening, Rose brought her a letter from a local teacher who wanted to visit the dairy with her students to show them the modern marvel of milk production. Magda helped prepare the tour. When the children arrived, curious and bright-eyed, she stood behind the glass partition, demonstrating how the system worked. A small boy waved through the window. She smiled back instinctively. For a brief, impossible moment, she felt free. After they left, she lingered near the cooling tanks, tracing her hand along the steel. She whispered to herself in German, then translated the words into English, testing how they sounded. "We were taught to conquer. They were taught to create." The hum of the machinery answered softly. A song of endless motion. Then everything changed. A military truck arrived at the camp one gray November morning, carrying a new batch of prisoners from a different facility. Among them was a woman whose very presence seemed to chill the air. Ingrid von Hausen, 32 years old, tall and rigid, with blue eyes cold as winter ice. She had been captured at the Falaise Pocket, one of the bloodiest battles in the Normandy campaign. Unlike Magda, who had managed supplies, Ingrid had commanded security operations. She was trained by those who believed ideology was everything and compassion was weakness. She took one look at the dairy at the German women working peacefully alongside Americans, and her lip curled in disgust. When she was assigned to Magda's training group, Ingrid's first words were delivered in sharp German. So, you've become their servant. Magda kept her voice level. We're prisoners. We work. Ingrid's eyes swept over the clean facility, the advanced machinery, the Americans working without fear. Prisoners maintain dignity. You've surrendered yours. The other women shifted uncomfortably. Some still harbored doubts about what they were doing here. Questions about whether cooperation meant betrayal. Ingrid's arrival gave voice to those doubts. That afternoon, Magda showed the new arrivals how the systems worked, how to clean the valves, how to monitor the pressure gauges, how to work with the machines instead of against them. Ingrid listened with barely concealed contempt. When Magda demonstrated the cleaning process, Ingrid deliberately knocked a piece of equipment to the floor. Oops! The word was ice. Challenge. Magda picked up the equipment without comment and continued the demonstration. But she could feel the tension spreading through the group like poison. Some of the newer prisoners watched Ingrid with something like admiration. Here was someone who hadn't forgotten who they were, who the enemy was. That night in the barracks, Ingrid held court. Her voice carried the certainty of someone who had never questioned the ideology she served. They're softening you, making you forget the fatherland. This kindness is a weapon. They want us docile, compliant, grateful for the scraps they throw us. She paused, letting her words sink in. Better to starve with dignity than feast with shame. Some of the prisoners nodded. The fear that they were being manipulated, that American kindness was just another form of control, had been lurking beneath the surface all along. Ingrid gave it voice. Liesel, sitting on her bunk, spoke up quietly. They give us food, shelter, respect. Ingrid's laugh was sharp. They give us chains we cannot see. Magda sat on her own bunk listening. For weeks she had been building something new inside herself. A different understanding of strength and power and what it meant to be human. But Ingrid's words struck at the foundation of that understanding. Was she being manipulated? Had she traded one form of imprisonment for another? That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark listening to the breathing of the other women and wondered which of them was right. The officer who clung to the old certainties or the prisoners who were beginning to believe in something new. The next morning brought no answers, only work. Magda moved through her duties with mechanical precision, her mind elsewhere. She was cleaning a valve assembly when she heard footsteps behind her. A man stood there watching her work. She had seen him before but never spoken to him. Jim Brennan, Rose's brother-in-law, the one who had lost his brother at Normandy. He was 29 with the kind of face that had known grief too young. Dusty boots, calloused hands. The quiet competence of someone who understood machines as well as he understood himself. You know how these work, it wasn't a question. Magda kept her hands moving, unsure how to respond to this man whose brother had died fighting her countrymen. I managed logistics, systems, supplies, for the Wehrmacht, yes. The word came out steady. She wouldn't apologize for what she had been, even if she was no longer sure what she believed. Jim was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. My brother Daniel died on Omaha Beach, 22 years old. Never got to see any of this. Peace, even small peace. Magda stopped working, met his eyes. I had a brother, Stalingrad, 1943. He was 20. The words hung between them. Two people who had lost what could never be returned, standing in a dairy barn in Texas, connected by grief that transcended nations. Jim handed her a tool she needed for the valve assembly. If you understand the machine, you respect it. That's what my dad taught me. In Germany, we were taught to dominate machines, make them obey. That's not how it works here. You cooperate with them. It was the simplest statement of philosophy Magda had ever heard, and the most profound. Cooperation instead of domination. Partnership instead of control. The American way distilled into a single sentence about machinery. Before she could respond, Bobby, the young worker, called for Jim. The moment broke, but something had shifted between them. Not friendship, not yet, but the possibility of it. That possibility terrified her more than any propaganda ever had. Early November brought the crisis that would define everything that came after. The main cooling system's pressure valve stuck during the morning shift. A simple mechanical failure that happened occasionally. Normally, Tom Brennan would fix it in 15 minutes, but this time when he tried the manual override, steam erupted. The scalding blast caught his hands. He stumbled back, cursing. Rose appeared from nowhere, wrapping his hands in cloth, her face pale. "Get him to the clinic." Now, an American worker helped Tom to a truck. Rose went with them, and suddenly the dairy floor descended into chaos. The temperature gauges were climbing. Without proper cooling, the day's production, 15,000 gallons worth thousands of dollars, would spoil in less than 20 minutes. The remaining Americans scrambled, unsure what to do. The system was too complex, too interconnected. One wrong move could make everything worse. Mrs. Henderson stood in the center of the floor, her face tight with worry. She looked around at her workers, all of them young and uncertain. Then her eyes found Magda. "Can you help?" The question cut through the noise like a blade. Every eye turned to Magda, the German prisoner, the enemy officer, the woman who had spent weeks learning these systems but had never been tested. Ingrid stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching. Her expression said everything. Here was the moment of truth. Would Magda help her captors? Would she prove that she had indeed traded her dignity for comfort? Magda looked at the rising temperature gauge, at the thousands of gallons about to be wasted, at the Americans who had shown her nothing but kindness for weeks. Then she looked at Ingrid's smug face, and she made her choice. Her voice came out sharp and clear, the voice of an officer who had commanded supply operations under artillery fire. "Frida, I need you on the valves. You understand pressure systems." Frida, the engineer, stepped forward immediately. "Liesel, get the tools. Full wrench set. Now." Liesel ran. Magda turned to Jim, who had appeared from the equipment room. "Shut down sectors 2 and 4. Reroute cooling water through backup lines." Jim hesitated for half a second, then moved. A German prisoner was giving him orders, and he was following them. "Bobby, start the secondary compressor." The teenage boy jumped to obey. For the next 15 minutes, the dairy became a military operation. Magda coordinated like she was managing a supply depot under fire. Frida applied her engineering knowledge to adapt the system. Jim followed Magda's instructions precisely. Liesel assisted with perfect timing. The Americans watched in stunned silence as the German women and their former enemies worked together with flawless precision. "The valve's stuck," Frida called out. "We need manual release while the system's still pressurized." "It's dangerous." "I'll do it," Jim said, moving forward. "No," Magda's voice stopped him. "I know the exact angle from my training. If I'm wrong, only I get hurt." Jim started to argue, then stopped. He looked at her face, saw the certainty there, and made a choice of his own. He trusted her. Magda positioned herself at the valve. Steam hissed around her. One wrong move and she would be scalded like Tom. But her hands were steady. She had done this 100 times in German facilities. The principles were the same. She released the valve with a sharp twist. Steam erupted, but she held her position. The system shuddered, groaned, then stabilized. The temperature gauge began to drop. It was over. Mrs. Henderson stood with her hand over her mouth, eyes wet. Tom's wife had just watched a German prisoner save their entire operation. "You saved us, our whole business, everything." Magda straightened, exhausted. "It's what needed to be done." The other American workers began to applaud, actually applauding. Bobby whooped like he was at a baseball game. That was better than any movie. Jim looked at her with something new in his eyes. Not just respect, something deeper. That was something else. But across the room, Ingrid's face had gone hard as stone. She had witnessed the ultimate betrayal, a German officer using her skills to save the enemy. That night, Ingrid cornered Magda in the equipment room. The confrontation was inevitable. "You've crossed a line. You're no longer one of us." Magda was too tired to be diplomatic. "Maybe I never was. Maybe we were fighting for the wrong reasons." The words were out before she could stop them. Truth she hadn't fully acknowledged until this moment. Honor, loyalty. These mean nothing to you. Honor died in the camps we built. Loyalty died with every lie we believed. Magda pulled out her journal, opened to a page she had written days before, and read aloud. "Discipline here means cooperation. Machines serve trust." Ingrid's voice dripped contempt. "You sound like propaganda." "No. Propaganda told us America was weak. That compassion was weakness." Magda pointed toward the dairy floor. "This is strength. Creation, not destruction." For a long moment, Ingrid said nothing. Then something in her face cracked. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Then what did we lose everything for? The question broke Magda's heart. Because she knew the answer. Had known it for weeks, but hadn't wanted to say it aloud. Nothing. That's the tragedy. We lost everything for nothing. She stepped forward and did something she never thought she would do. She embraced Ingrid, the woman who represented everything she was trying to leave behind. The woman who was trapped in the same cage Magda had only just escaped. Go home when the war ends, rebuild, but rebuild something better. Ingrid didn't respond, but for the first time since her arrival, the rigid certainty in her posture softened. Just a little, just enough to show she was still human underneath the ideology. The next morning, Mrs. Henderson made an announcement that changed everything. Effective immediately, Margaret Schmidt is appointed lead coordinator for all POW work details at Henderson Dairy. This is a paid position. Wages will be held in trust for after the war. Magda was the first POW in the entire Camp Hearn system to receive such a role. Some prisoners celebrated. Liesel hugged her with tears of joy. Frida beamed with pride. But others watched in silent resentment. To them, Magda had become what Ingrid accused her of being, a collaborator, a traitor to everything they had fought for. That night, Magda wrote in her journal by lamplight, "Today I became something I never imagined. Not quite American, not quite German anymore. Something in between, something new. I don't know if this is betrayal or evolution, but I know I cannot go back to who I was. That person died the day someone told me we spill milk, not blood." Outside, the November wind carried the scent of coming winter. Inside the barracks, the women lay in their bunks, each wrestling with her own questions about loyalty and survival, and what it meant to be human in a world that seemed determined to make them choose. And in the dairy, the machines hummed through the night, indifferent to nations and ideologies, creating abundance, while the world tore itself apart. By December 1944, winter winds swept across the flat Texas plains, carrying the smell of cold earth and smoke from distant ranch fires. The dairy continued its rhythm, unbroken, tireless, the heartbeat of a nation untouched by war. Inside the barn, the air stayed warm, machines gleaming under electric light. For Magda, each shift now felt strangely timeless, as though life had always been this steady. But the illusion cracked when the guards brought newspapers from Europe. The front page carried headlines that silenced them all. Aachen, a city Magda had known as a girl, now reduced to rubble. Later came other reports. Cologne bombed, Dresden burning, the Ardennes erupting in Germany's desperate last offensive. The Reich, she realized, was collapsing faster than anyone had dared to say aloud. At lunch that day, she sat quietly, the paper folded beside her plate. Rose noticed. Bad news. Magda hesitated. Home. Everything gone. Rose reached over and placed her hand softly on Magda's wrist. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of someone who understood loss. Then you start again. That's what we do here. When storms come, we start again. The words stayed with her long after lunch ended. Start again. As if it were that simple. As if you could shed your entire past like an old coat and walk forward into something new. That evening, Magda stood by the loading dock as trucks departed, engines humming under the vast Texas sky. Each vehicle carried thousands of bottles. Milk for children, soldiers, hospitals. No rationing, no panic, no shortages. The contrast cut deeper than any wound. In Germany, people were boiling weeds to survive. Here, the enemy was shipping milk by the ton, feeding strangers without fear of running out. That night, as the women gathered in the barracks, Liesel spoke through tears. I dreamed of my mother today. She used to say if we worked hard, Germany would be strong forever. Her voice cracked. Now we work harder than ever, but for them. And I'm not ashamed anymore. No one answered. They didn't have to. The silence was full of surrender, but also peace, the kind of peace that comes when you stop fighting against truth. The next morning, Magda arrived early and walked the empty barn before the machine started. She ran her fingers along the steel rail, feeling the faint warmth from yesterday's work. It never stops. It never needs to. America's secret wasn't luck or geography. It was endurance. The factory didn't wait for orders from above. It worked because everyone from farmer to foreman believed in the system they'd built together. It wasn't ideology. It was faith in work itself. Christmas Eve 1944 brought an unexpected gift. Rose invited the entire POW work detail to her home for a small celebration. The women walked through the cold evening air, their breath making clouds in the darkness. Inside Rose's house, the warmth hit them like an embrace. A small tree stood in the corner, decorated with simple ornaments. The smell of baked bread filled the air. Rose's children were there, Bobby the teenage worker from the dairy, and Mary his 8-year-old sister with bright, curious eyes. Mary approached Liesel shyly. "Do you celebrate Christmas in Germany?" Liesel's eyes filled with tears. "We used to." The simple past tense carried everything. A world that had existed before the war, traditions that might never return. Rose served food, turkey and stuffing, cornbread and beans, pumpkin pie that tasted like sweetness itself. The German women ate slowly, trying to make each bite last, trying to memorize what kindness tasted like. After dinner, someone turned on the radio. Music drifted through the room. Not propaganda, not marching songs, just music. Glenn Miller, Bing Crosby, the sound of a country at peace even while at war. Jim appeared in the doorway home from his shift at another facility. His eyes found Magda's across the room. He didn't smile, but something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, the acknowledgement that enemies could become something else if they chose to. Later, he found her on the porch looking out at the dark fields. "When I first saw you, I thought I'd hate you. Because of Dan." Magda kept her eyes on the horizon. "I understand. I looked at you and thought the same. But you're not him. You're just you." The words hung in the cold air. Jim stepped closer, and for a moment Magda thought he might kiss her. But Bobby called from inside, and the moment broke. Still something had been said, without words. A possibility acknowledged. As 1944 turned to 1945, news from Europe grew worse. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last desperate offensive, ended in failure. Soviet forces pushed from the east, Allied forces from the west. The vice tightened. In the barracks at night, some women cried, others sat in silence. Ingrid, who had been so certain of German victory, grew quieter with each passing week. The ideology that had sustained her was crumbling under the weight of reality. By April, the writing was on every wall. Hitler was in his bunker. Berlin was surrounded. The end was days away, maybe hours. And then it came. May 8th, 1945. A guard rode to the dairy with a telegram. He dismounted slowly as if the weight of the paper in his hand was almost too much to bear. He read it aloud in halting German. "Germany has surrendered. The war in Europe is over." For a long time, no one spoke. The machines kept running their steady hum, indifferent to history. Magda stood by the bottling line, a half-filled crate in her hands. Years of her life collapsed into a single breath. The war was over. Germany had lost. Everything she had believed in, fought for, organized and managed, and made efficient, had ended in complete defeat. Around her, women reacted in different ways. Liesel broke down, crying, relief and grief mixed together until they were indistinguishable. Frida stared at her hands covered in the honest dirt of work. Ingrid's face went blank, as if someone had turned off a light inside her. That afternoon, Mrs. Henderson arrived with coffee, her movements slow and careful. "You're free now." The words landed like a question, not a gift. Free to go where home was a crater, a memory of gray skies and broken walls. The Germany they had served no longer existed. Magda walked alone across the Texas plains that evening, needing space to think. The sky stretched endless above her, so different from the close-pressed buildings of Hamburg. She thought about her parents if they were still alive. Her brothers graved in Stalingrad, the country that had sent her to war and then collapsed while she was milking cows in Texas. Rose found her standing by a windmill watching the sunset. "You sure, honey, about what? About staying? Because you know you can. Claire's already filed the paperwork. Sponsorship, work guarantee. You can stay if you want." Magda hadn't realized she'd already made the decision until Rose said it out loud. But standing there in the fading light, she knew the truth. "I've already started again." The words felt right, complete. She wasn't running from Germany. She was walking towards something new. Over the following weeks, Red Cross officers arrived to process repatriation paperwork. Most prisoners were scheduled to return to Europe by summer. The camps were emptying, POWs were going home. But when the list reached Camp Hearn, several names had been crossed out. Voluntary hold, the clerk explained, means they asked to stay. The women gathered to discuss their choices. For some, the decision was obvious. For others, it tore them apart. Ingrid chose to return immediately. She refused to look at Magda when she announced her decision. I will never bow to them. Germany will rise again. It must. But her voice lacked the old certainty. She was going home not because she believed anymore, but because she didn't know how to be anything other than what she had been. Before she left, she found Magda alone in the equipment room. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Former enemies, current strangers, almost friends. You were right, Ingrid said quietly. We lost everything for nothing. Then she left and Magda never saw her again. Years later, a single letter would arrive from Frankfurt where Ingrid worked in reconstruction. The tone would be softer, almost gentle. You were right, we are starting again. But that was still in the future. Frida chose to stay. Her decision was practical, as everything about Frida was practical. Germany needs engineers, but I can send money from here, and maybe bring my children later. She had received word that her husband had been killed in the final defense of Berlin. 2 children waited for her in an orphanage. Tom Brennan, whose hands had healed from the steam burns, helped her navigate the paperwork to bring them to America. Family is family, he said simply, as if sponsoring the children of a German engineer was the most natural thing in the world. Liesel's choice was the hardest. Her mother's letters begged her to return. Hamburg needed its daughters. Germany needed to rebuild. But Liesel had found something in Texas, not just safety, but purpose. She had learned that cooperation worked better than fear, that systems built on trust lasted longer than systems built on force. One night she came to Magda's bunk, her face wet with tears. If I stay, am I abandoning them? Magda took her hand. Only you can answer that. Liesel was quiet for a long time. Someone needs to bring this back to Germany. Someone needs to teach them what we learned here. Cooperation instead of commands. Trust instead of fear. She looked up, her young face suddenly a little older. I'll be a bridge between worlds. And so she chose to return, not out of obligation, but out of purpose. She would take the lessons of the Texas dairy back to Hamburg and help rebuild her country with American principles. Years later, letters would come describing her work as chief engineer at a modernized dairy facility, teaching German workers the systems she had learned in enemy territory. For Magda, the choice had already been made. Claire Henderson sponsored her officially. The paperwork was filed. She would stay. But there was one more piece that needed to fall into place. Jim found her by the cooling tanks one evening in June. The setting sun poured through the windows, turning everything gold. I've been carrying Dan's death like a weapon, he said without preamble. Against you, against myself, against everything. Magda waited, knowing he needed to say this. But you showed me something. When you saved the dairy, when you chose to help instead of watching us fail. You chose life. He stepped closer. I don't know if this is right, if it's too soon, if people will understand. But I need to ask. Magda stopped him with a kiss. Brief, gentle. The first time their lips had touched. When she pulled back, her eyes were clear. It's right because we choose it. Jim reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. Simple. Handmade from a piece of polished steel, bent and shaped in the dairy's workshop. Not fancy. It's perfect. It's us. They set the date for September, exactly 2 years after Magda had first arrived at the dairy. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Some townspeople objected. A German marrying an American so soon after the war felt wrong to them. Disrespectful to the dead. But Sergeant Morrison, who had overseen the POW camp, spoke up at a town meeting. She saved American milk, American jobs, American lives when that cooling system failed. That's American enough for me. The community rallied, slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. Bobby's family offered their barn for the reception. Mexican ranch hands from a neighboring property volunteered to play music. Rose donated her wedding dress, carefully altered to fit Magda's smaller frame. September 1946, the same field where the military truck had stopped 2 years ago, where Magda had stepped onto Texas soil expecting punishment and found possibility instead. A simple ceremony, Claire Henderson officiating, having gotten herself ordained through a mail-order certificate that seemed slightly questionable but entirely legal. Guests gathered, dairy workers, townspeople, a few former POWs who had also chosen to stay. Frida stood as maid of honor, her 2 children having arrived from Germany just weeks before. The ceremony was about to begin when a military jeep pulled up. A man in uniform stepped out and Magda's breath caught. Captain Daniel Patterson, the American officer who had accepted her surrender at Cherbourg, who had given her water when she expected execution, who had processed her as a POW with unexpected kindness. She hadn't seen him since that day in France. He walked toward her, and Jim tensed protectively. But Patterson was smiling. I heard a German logistics officer who surrendered at Cherbourg was getting married in Texas. Had to see if it was really you. Jim's hand moved to Magda's back. We're kind of in the middle of something. Patterson extended his hand to Jim. I know. That's why I came. He turned to Magda. At Cherbourg, you expected us to shoot you. I saw it in your eyes. You stood there in that abandoned headquarters surrounded by burning documents, waiting to die. Magda nodded, unable to speak. Instead, I gave you water and processed you as Poe. You made the right choice then, and you're making the right choice now. He handed her an envelope. Found this through Red Cross channels. Thought you'd want it today. Inside was a photograph. Her parents standing in front of a partially rebuilt building in Hamburg. Alive. Thin but alive. Her mother's handwriting on the back. We are proud of you. Live well. Magda broke down crying, joy and relief flooding through her in equal measure. Jim held her while she shook with sobs that released 2 years of fear and uncertainty. Patterson saluted her, a gesture of respect from former captor to former prisoner. Then he shook Jim's hand and took a seat in the back row. The ceremony continued, vows spoken in both English and German, honoring both worlds. I was taught to conquer, Magda said, her voice steady now. You taught me to create. I was taught to hate, Jim replied. You taught me to heal. They kissed under the Texas sky, and the dairy whistle blew, a sound Jim had arranged celebrating not just a marriage but a transformation. The reception lasted into the night, music and dancing, food and laughter, former enemies celebrating the union of two people who had chosen love over legacy, future over past. Many of you watching probably remember stories from your parents or grandparents about this time, about German or Italian POWs working on American farms. Maybe your family employed them, maybe you saw them in town. If you have stories about how former enemies became neighbors or even friends, share them in the comments. These histories matter. They remind us that even in our darkest conflicts, humanity can prevail. Click like if you believe that America's true strength has always been its values, not just its weapons. Because what happened to Magda and Jim proves exactly that. 4 years later, 1950, Magda and Jim owned a small piece of land near Waco. 25 cows, a modest operation but profitable. Theirs. The house had a blue kitchen, the same shade as the dress Claire Henderson had worn the first day they met. Magda had insisted on that color. A reminder of where she had started. Pecan trees she had planted were growing strong, now their branches reaching toward the sky. On quiet mornings, she would sit under them with coffee and think about the strange path that had brought her here. Letters came regularly from Germany. Liesel wrote about the dairy she was building in Hamburg, using American techniques, teaching cooperation instead of commands. Her facility was producing milk for thousands of children. She had married a fellow engineer. They had 2 children. Frieda's children were thriving in Texas schools. Her daughter wanted to be a teacher. Her son loved baseball, that most American of sports. Frieda had been promoted to supervisor at Henderson Dairy, which had expanded significantly after the war. Even Ingrid had written once in 1948, "Working Reconstruction in Frankfurt." The tone was softer. "You were right," she had written. "We are starting again." Magda had cried when she read those words. One morning in late 1950, a young man arrived at Henderson Dairy. He was 19, nervous part of the Marshall Plan exchange program, a German student sent to learn American dairy techniques to bring back to his rebuilding country. Claire Henderson, now 71, and moving slower but still sharp, had asked Magda to help with the orientation. The young man's name was Carl. He stood at the barn entrance looking at the machinery inside with the same mixture of fear and wonder Magda remembered from her own first day. She walked up to him and smiled. "It's cooler inside." The exact words Claire had spoken to her 6 years ago. Full circle. She showed him the systems, the cooling tanks, the bottling lines, the machinery that had once seemed impossible and now felt like home. "These machines don't serve cruelty," she told him in German, then translated to English. "They serve trust." Carl looked at her with questions in his eyes. Did you ever regret it? Staying, Magda paused, looked across the floor where Jim was working on a valve assembly, looked at the fields stretching to the horizon, looked at the life she had built from the ruins of the one she had lost. I lost my country, but I found civilization. She turned back to Carl. Civilization isn't geography. It's how we treat each other when we don't have to. Later that day, she stood by the glass partition where she had stood so many times before, watching milk flow through pipes. Jim joined her, his arm around her waist. Outside, a truck rolled away carrying crates of bottled milk bound for schools and hospitals across Texas. White, pure, ordinary. But to Magda, it would always be proof of something extraordinary. That mercy and trust could outlast any empire built on fear. Her reflection appeared in the polished steel valve, not the frightened prisoner of 19 not the rigid officer of the Wehrmacht. Someone new, someone who had been broken and remade into something stronger. Behind her reflection, she could see the barn, the machines, the workers, all of it humming with purpose and life. The sound was constant, the heartbeat of creation. That night, she made a final entry in her journal, the same journal she had kept since capture. Its pages chronicled her transformation from enemy to immigrant, from prisoner to citizen, from conqueror to creator. She wrote in English now, the language of her new country. They asked me once what America's secret weapon was. I said milk. They laughed. But I meant it. Not the milk itself, but the system that creates it. Not force, but trust. Not commands, but cooperation. Not fear, but faith in tomorrow. That's the weapon that wins. Not battles, but futures. She closed the journal and set it on the shelf. Tomorrow she would wake early and drive to the dairy. She would check the systems and train the new workers and ensure everything ran smoothly. She would do the work she had chosen in the country she had chosen with the man she had chosen. And somewhere milk would flow to children who didn't know war, who didn't know what it meant to be hungry or afraid or conquered, who drank abundance like it was their birthright. Because in America it was. The greatest victories of the greatest generation weren't won on battlefields. They were won in moments like these, in dairies and farms and factories across America, where enemies became neighbors, where hatred became understanding, where the values we claimed to fight for were proven real. If you believe those values still matter, if you believe kindness is strength, not weakness, share this story. Because the world needs to remember, America's true power was never in its weapons. It was in what it chose to do when the fighting stopped. Between 1943 and 1946, over 400,000 German POWs were held in camps across the United States. Many worked on farms and factories and at industrial sites. While experiences varied, numerous accounts describe humane treatment that challenged their expectations. Approximately 5,000 chose to stay in America after the war, building new lives in their former enemy's land. This is one such story, in memory of the greatest generation on both sides who chose to build rather than destroy. The camera pulls back, Texas sunset pouring gold across the dairy, machines humming their eternal song, people working together, life continuing, and somewhere in that ordinary miracle proof that the best of America was never its might but its mercy, never its power to destroy but its capacity to create, never its ability to make enemies but its willingness to make them into something else, into neighbors, into friends, into family, into proof that even the deepest divisions can be healed if we choose cooperation over conquest, trust over fear, tomorrow over yesterday. That choice, more than any weapon, more than any battle, is what made America great, and it still does.